Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Everyone knows the 1927 Yankees. Ruth, Gehrig, Murderers Row. But you don't hear much about the pitchers. And that's a shame, because their ace was Waite Hoyt, who not only had a Hall of Fame career, but lived an incredible life that saw him perform on vaudeville, drink with Al Capone, and become a beloved Reds announcer. Tim Manner's book, Schoolboy, uses Hoyt's own words to construct a memoir about the forgotten baseball great's incredible life. I loved it, and I'm sure you will too. Enjoy. Welcome, Tim. How are you doing today?
I'm living the schoolboy dream, Scott.
That's good. Where does this idea come from? How does this begin for you?
Well, it's actually the backstory in this book is almost as interesting as the book itself in a way. I still wouldn't know who Waite Hoyt was, except that one of his sons is a close friend of mine who I've known for about 40 years. I had known Chris Hoyt for about 2 years before he even mentioned who his famous father was. And, I think he was just bored and trying to make conversation. We were in a car coming back from a meeting in New York City. I was in the PR business and he was my client. And he just sort of cast me this sideways glance and said, my father was a Hall of Fame pitcher for the 1927 Yankees. That got my attention,
Yeah.
And I sat up straight. I was like, well, what was his name? And he said, Waite Hoyt. And I thought, who, what, when, where, why, Waite Hoyt? And I was embarrassed, frankly, that I did not know who he was. And I could not believe that someone as important to the origin of modern day baseball was so unknown to me and obviously to many others. I went home and got on Google and Wikipedia and I just couldn't believe, what I saw. He just led a truly extraordinary life and was so important to the 1927 era's Yankees, which set the standard for the very definition of a great baseball team to the present day.
How do you start writing this book?
Well, so as I said, I had known Chris for quite a long time, and over the years, the subject of his dad would come up, obviously, and in particular, the fact that his father had never finished writing a memoir. He had made something like 5 attempts to write a memoir. And Chris would send me bits and pieces of things that his dad had written. And it was all interesting, but very incomplete and inconsistent and, just not something that was publishable. And I was visiting Chris, it was 4 years ago now. It was literally 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. He lives out in Arizona. And the subject came up yet again. We were at dinner. And Chris just looked at me and said, I have 8 boxes of my dad's papers, and I'm sending them to you. And so the next thing I know, there are 8 boxes of Waite Hoyt's papers, his stuff, sitting on my front porch. And, my first thought was, oh my God, what if there's nothing in here? What am I going to tell Chris? So I dragged the boxes inside and went upstairs and started going through them. And it was pretty chaotic at first. I mean, it was all organized. It was in file folders. Some of them were wrapped in string. And the reason that these records existed at all was that Chris's cousin Ellen, so Waite's niece, had it in mind to write a book of her own, a biography, which never happened. But she had all this background material collected, in hopes of doing that. So she was actually the one who sent me the boxes. Chris didn't. So I started going through it. There's all kinds of stuff in there. There's letters, newspaper clippings, cassette recordings, photographs, diaries, memoir attempts. And then finally, I happened upon this thick plastic binder full of hundreds of pages of interview transcripts that Ellen had conducted with her uncle just about, a year or two before he passed.
Wow.
And when I found that, I knew I had pay dirt, that I would be able to take that and put together not a biography of Waite Hoyt, which I think at this point would have been very challenging to do because everybody who knew him has long passed. That was what Ellen was trying to do. And even 1984, that was a very tough road. But when I saw these transcripts, I thought I could do a true memoir. I mean, I could see that the entire narrative story was there. It wasn't necessarily in order. It wasn't like I just had to, rekey it and clean it up. It needed a lot of, finessing and orchestrating. But that's where the whole thing came from. And it really is, I feel, the gift of this project, which is the most fun I've ever had with anything in my life, was just taking this and putting it together and reanimating this amazing journey of Waite Hoyt.
He really is a very good writer. He has this really great voice. How important was that for you to try to get right?
He passed away about I think the same year that I met Chris. So I
Yeah.
never had the chance to meet him.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm all about voice and
Yeah.
finding the voice and recognizing the voice. Those transcripts were really critical to that. The other advantage I have was knowing Chris so well, and they sound exactly alike. So I was reading this, when Waite would start to rant about something, I immediately thought of Chris. I could just hear Chris saying it. Now, there were materials in this box, memoir attempts that Waite had not written, that were done by ghostwriters. And so I was able, because of the transcripts, to very quickly get a read on what was him and what was not him. It seemed like the ghostwriters felt we're trying a little too hard, maybe, clever by half or whatever, to just make him sound funny and goofy all the time, which he was not at all. I mean, he did have that side to him, but as you've read the book, Scott, I'm sure you recognize that he was a very introspective, serious guy.
Yeah, he came across as a very real guy for someone who had such an incredible life, very much a real person with his own demons.
Well, yeah, he did have his demons, and it's extraordinary for someone to have led the life he did and have been so successful in so many ways. He was one of these people who you kind of hate in a way because he was good at everything he tried. I mean, it wasn't just that he was a baseball player; he was on vaudeville, and he was hanging out with Mae West and Jimmy Durante and the Marx Brothers. He became an oil painter later on in life and sold 30 commissioned pieces. And then, of course, his career is the beloved radio voice of the Cincinnati Reds for 24 years. So if anybody, should have a big head, it would be Waite Hoyt, but he was always questioning. And I think this really goes to the heart of the central conflict of the book. That even though here is a guy he's in the Hall of Fame, which is not nothing. I mean, as you know, Scott, it's about 1% of all players who get into the Hall of Fame. It's not like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame where they let everybody in, even people who don't play rock and roll. Go figure. People don't even want to be in the
No.
Rock and Roll
Yeah.
Hall of Fame. Somehow they get inducted. And yet he felt always this tension that maybe he should have done something else with his life. And what I think is really cool about the book is that there was enough information in there that I could kind of get at the root of why that was, because it was not, necessarily easy to suss that out. But it all goes back, basically, like with everybody else, to his mom and his dad, not to get all psychoanalytical about it. But his mother was a very prim and proper, almost Victorian woman, very smart, very intellectual, all about respectability, being respectable in life. And she wanted nothing more for her son than for him to go to college and get a real job and be a respectable member of society. Now, his father, on the other hand, was the opposite of that. He was a total baseball nut. And he was also a vaudevillian. So Waite was following in his dad's footsteps that way. So you can guess which direction he took. He followed in his dad's footsteps, but he was always looking over his shoulder, kind of haunted almost by his mom's admonitions about respectability and what it really meant to be successful. And you have to keep in mind the context of that era, Scott. That baseball then is not nearly what it is now, especially going into the minor leagues as he did very early on. As a teenager, he was this 15, 16, 17-year-old kid, and he was shipped off to places like Hardscrabble, Lebanon, Pennsylvania, where before you play a game, the players have to clear the field of rocks, and if the spectators don't like the way the game is going, they might start throwing the rocks at the players, which was never happened to Waite, but it was known to happen. A shower was just a bucket with holes punched in it. He was this teenager playing with men twice his age who were getting into all kinds of things that a teenager should not be getting into, like drugs and how's this of ill repute, things of that nature. He saw all kinds of awful things. He saw a mafia hit right outside his bedroom window, a tar and feathering. He saw a lynching. It was really, he called it a bath in badness, and things that a fellow shouldn't know is the way that he put it in the book. That was a moment of, an example of his eloquence and his way of kind of capturing what was going on in his life.
So John McGraw in the Giants, he joins
Yeah,
them at 15. What is his relationship like with McGraw? It seems like it's a little bit up and down. And at one point, he even thinks about quitting baseball before he even really begins to become the star that he became.
very much up and down with John McGraw. I mean, McGraw clearly saw something in this 15-year-old kid, offered him a contract at the time, the youngest player ever signed to a major league deal. I mean, it wasn't exactly a real contract. It was more accurately an option to play. It was a $5 bonus, no money. His father took the $5 bill from him and said that's too much money for a young man, and bought himself a hat. Waite said he could have killed him, but what McGraw did was he just kept sending Waite down into the minors. I mean, he went through like 8 or 9 different teams in the minor leagues at that time, and the teams were terrible. The managers were terrible. The conditions were, as I just described, were really awful, and he wasn't getting better as a pitcher. This went on for 3 years, and he finally, reached the end of that point. I don't know what the rules are now, but back then you couldn't keep a player in the minors for more than 3 years without bringing him up to the majors. I think, it wasn't that McGraw was trying to be mean or anything, or didn't like or see the potential in Wade. I think clearly he did. He worked with him on his pitching personally. There's just the opportunity didn't present itself. I think if he thought that Wade could have helped the Giants win, he would have brought him up, but that opportunity just never quite manifested itself. With McGraw, it was mostly a story of regret, I think, on both sides. And McGraw admitted as much years later that one of the things that he most felt badly about in his life, if he felt badly about anything, was letting Waite Hoyt go in 1919.
So he gets let go, and then he ends up joining the Red Sox. But it's not a straight path there. What does he do in between there?
Well, as you mentioned, Scott, he actually decided he was going to quit baseball at that point. But somewhat miraculously, he was contacted by various gentlemen from the industrial leagues. And these were teams, which I was not aware of any of this. I don't know about you, but I had never
No,
heard of industrial leagues.
no.
But these were companies like tire manufacturers or shipbuilding company, where you would technically take a job with them, play on their team. You actually wouldn't have to work in any factory or build any ships. But that was the deal. And so it just came along. This opportunity came along, and Waite decided to take it. And I think it was just a sort of a confluence of the moment for him, where he was a bit older, so he was more developed as a pitcher, and he was playing with better players and better managers. And so he very quickly actually came to the attention of the Boston Red Sox. He pitched his first game actually against the Detroit Tigers, and Ty Cobb. And he was kind of Waite, this is just sort of an example of the kind of sassy kid that he was. When he met with Barrow, he said, I'll sign your contract, Mr. Barrow, but you have to let me play within 4 days of my reporting to the Red Sox. And Barrow was just aghast. Who is this kid? You've got a lot of nerve, kid. And then he just sort of sat back and said, we could use some of that around here. And of course, it worked out great for the Red Sox, with Barrow and the Red Sox, and obviously later on with the Yankees.
What is his tenure with the Red Sox like?
Well, it was really only a season. It was 2 seasons, but really only one full season, which the first year was very successful. The second year, not at all, because he had injured himself. It was actually some locker room horseplay. It was a weird game they were playing where there was a light hanging from the locker room ceiling, and they were taking turns trying to kick it. And so he suffered a groin injury that landed him in the hospital, and he was pretty much out for the season because of that, and rendered so weak that he was in no condition really to play, for the Red Sox or any other team. But his father, of course, not, content to let that go, worked with him over the winter. I mean, this is an example of how quaint things were back then compared to now. So he and his dad were out there in the middle of the winter, working out, and snow on the ground and ice and everything else. People must have thought they were crazy, but he personally, not only did he rehabilitate his son, but he reported on Waite's progress to Ed Barrow, who had now moved over to the Yankees and had engineered the whole Babe Ruth purchase, and assured Barrow that Waite was in great condition, and purely on Waite's father's word. Waite was part of a big trade between the Red Sox and the Yankees that reunited Waite with Babe Ruth. Actually, they had been on the Red Sox together, and then Ruth was traded. So this was roughly about a year after the big Ruth deal that Waite joined the Yankees.
There's a lot to talk about with the Yankee tenure here. Let's start with Babe Ruth, because especially as he gets older, he becomes a really big voice to keep the memory of Babe alive. There's the famous radio address he did, which I think you posted on YouTube, which is fantastic. Everyone should go listen to it. I've listened to it. It's really great hearing his voice and him talking about the Babe. But their relationship wasn't always completely friendly. In fact, I think there was even a fight or two in there. It was a little bit rough there for a while. What was that relationship like? How did that develop over the years?
So you're right. Early on, it was bumpy, to say the least. And actually, I think the next thing that Chris Hoyt told me after he told me that his dad was Hall of Fame New York Yankee from the 1920s, he said, and yeah, he got into a fist fight with Babe Ruth. It was what maybe perhaps most proud of, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's like, you think about it, a fist fight with Babe Ruth, really,
It's a pretty good two truths and a lie. I don't know if anyone would believe that one. That's a good one, yeah.
So they feuded actually for 2 years, and it was really coming from Babe Ruth, not Waite. Waite didn't really understand, or claimed not to really understand, why Babe got so mad at him, although they were both dating the same showgirl, which
doesn't help.
Might have had a little something to do with it, just possibly. But the story goes, it was an afternoon game at Yankee Stadium. Waite was pitching, and it was a routine pop-up fly ball, and the Babe just let it drop. And, as Waite put it, he short-legged it. And Waite turned around, hands on his hips, and glared at the Babe, and they got back into the dugout, and they had words, and then it continued in the locker room, that it just escalated, and the fists began to fly. We don't really know exactly whether punches were landed. It sounded like probably not. Miller Huggins, the manager of the Yankees, who was about 5'4", in between the two of them, I think he got punched. But in any case, they didn't talk for 2 years after that, and Waite, it was a source of discomfort for him. He really liked Babe Ruth, and he was very unhappy that they had this very poor relationship, and it just finally ended very suddenly, where Babe offered Waite a beer. They were on a train back from, I think, St. Louis, and as Babe sometimes did, he would buy up food, in this case ribs and beer, and I think he sold it to the teammates, but he made it available to them. And Waite was passing by, and the Babe just said, have a beer, kid. We're good. It's okay. It's over. That was the end of the feud. But, to your point, Scott, they later on in life became very close friends. I mean, Waite was a pallbearer at the Babe's funeral. And there's a famous quote from him, which maybe you've seen floating around, where I think it was Joe Dugan said, man, it's hot, because it was like mid to late August at the funeral. And Dugan said, I really could use a beer right now. And Waite said, yeah, so could the Babe. Yeah.
That's really great. So 27 Yankees, Murderers Row. We always think about the lineup, but he really was the pitcher on that team. What was he like as a pitcher?
Well, it was a lot simpler then. He really only had 2 pitches. He had a fastball, which was his money pitch, and he had a what he called a change of pace pitch, which was a changeup basically.
Yeah.
And he worked those 2 pitches. Later on, he developed, sort of it was not a knuckleball, but a palm ball.
Oh, okay, yeah. You don't see a lot of those anymore, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's actually a photo of him. It's not in the book, but I've posted it because there's a Waite Hoyt page on Facebook where he's demonstrating that pitch, which actually I think was taught to him by his high school coach, and he kind of brought it back. Is because he had no curveball at all. And his father claimed that his grandfather had invented the curveball, which of course is probably not true. In any case, Waite said that he did not inherit that ability to throw a curveball. But what he would do with the curveball is he often used it as his first pitch, on the theory that most batters would just swing at the first thing, so he'd throw his worst pitch at them, and they would generally miss because it wasn't what they were expecting, and that worked. But he was, as far as his the results that he got from that. He was the ace pitcher of the 2017. He was the best pitcher in all of baseball in 1927. And if you look at the whole of the 20s, he had, I think, the best record of all the staff, of any of the staff. And there were some heroics in there, like the 1921 World Series, which is just an amazing thing, where he pitched 9 complete innings, 3 games in that series, did not allow an earned run, which the
That's
only pitcher
amazing.
to do something similar was Christy Mathewson at that time. Of course, the Yankees still managed to lose in that series. But it, kind of goes to the point where everybody, nobody remembers the pitchers. It's always and that's understandable. Babe Ruth was a sensation and Lou Gehrig, and people went to the ballpark to see them hit bombs. They weren't necessarily paying that much attention to the pitcher. But bottom line is, those Yankees teams would not have been as successful without Waite Hoyt, because he was keeping the score down on the other side. And he was known as a money pitcher. And his World Series ERA is half of his lifetime ERAs. It was 1.89.
Wow.
Which is, pretty amazing. And he was known for low scoring games, which drove the owner of the Yankees crazy, because those usually were close games. He liked to see a big score, so he would have been happier if Wade allowed 6 runs, if they won 12-6 than 2-1. But that was, sort of this very special relationship with Jacob Ruppert.
So during the 20s, he really is sort of this quintessential Roaring '20s kind of figure. I'm surprised he didn't show up at Gatsby's party. Like he would have totally have been a guy who you could have seen there. He has this really interesting life beyond just baseball during the 20s. Yeah. He gets known as the Merry Mortician. How does that come about?
Well, he hated that nickname.
Did he really?
So he became a mortician part-time because, they didn't make as much money. Obviously back then, baseball players, and he needed a supplementary income. And he was also sort of thinking ahead to what he might do after he retired from baseball. So he got into being a funeral director because that was his father-in-law's business. His first wife, Dorothy, that was her dad, Harry Pyle, had a very successful mortuary business. And Waite was thinking, well, maybe I'll take that over, someday. But after a sit-down conversation with his father-in-law, told him, no, I'm not leaving the business to you. That'll go to my wife. He decided to get out of it. But there is a funny story attached to this. So there was an afternoon game at Yankee Stadium, and Waite had a body that he needed to deliver from the funeral home. He actually had started his own funeral business after his father kind of cut him off a little bit in Larchmont, New York. And so he had to deliver a body to Brooklyn. And he had this game that he also had to pitch. So he packed the body into basically the trunk of a car. I mean, it wasn't really a proper hearse or anything. Put some ice in there, whatever. Drove it to Yankee Stadium, parked it in the lot there, pitched the game, got in the car, and carried on to Brooklyn to deliver the body.
Oh man, this was not the dead ball era. That'd be too good. That'd be too good of a joke. I know. That's yeah. So his dad was in vaudeville, and then he ends up going in vaudeville too. Do you have any idea what his act was like? What he would do?
He didn't leave behind any great descriptions of that. It's just it was a lot of there's some song and dance. He could sing. Damn him, he could sing.
Yeah, right.
And he could dance. He made the thing about the whole vaudeville career was that he was making 3 times as much money playing vaudeville stages as he was with the Yankees. There was demand all across the country at the biggest vaudeville houses of the time to see the Yankee pitching star sing and dance. So there, were jokes and so forth. And, I think he would come out in his Yankees uniform and then would change into a tuxedo and things. I think it was mostly, pretty corny kind of vaudeville stuff. But obviously people liked it, because he made a lot of money at it. It was very much at odds with his career as a baseball player, though. And the Yankees were not at all happy that he was on vaudeville. It was bad for his conditioning. He was doing it mostly in the off season, but he would return for spring training really not in great shape. And Miller Huggins in particular was on him, to please stop doing that. But he couldn't resist the money. And I think Waite's point of view, which, he was just a kid, was, well, pay me enough and I'll stop doing it. The Yankees wouldn't give him a raise. He wanted $20,000. I think he topped out at around 16 or 18. To pay a pitcher $20,000 at that time was unheard of. Babe Ruth, of course, was getting upwards of 80,000. By today's dollars, I don't know what that translates into, but it's a pretty good sum of money.
Not Ohtani money, but it's but pretty good. Yeah. I even saw an article in 2015 saying that he co-wrote "Santa Claus is Coming to Town." What is the story about this?
That's a myth.
It is, yeah. And I was at New York Daily News calling him out on the podcast right now. But it was a New York Daily News article I saw where they even said that he was still the co-writer. How does that all come about?
It's false. What happened was, so his partner in vaudeville was a guy named J. Fred Coots, who nobody remembers anymore, most likely. But his claim to fame was that he wrote "Santa Claus is Coming to Town," and probably because they were partners and associated with each other on vaudeville. For some reason, a publisher at some point issued sheet music for the song that had a picture of the two of them probably because he thought it would sell more copies.
Yeah,
a picture of the two of them on the cover, and crediting Waite with having co-written the song. Chris Hoyt wishes that were true.
Yeah, right. That'd be amazing. I think my favorite part, he goes to Chicago and he meets Al Capone. This guy lived life in the 20s here. He did everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's often it's a little bit like Forrest Gump or Zelig, like that. It's like, how did this guy show up in so many places with so many people? So he was in Chicago, of course, with the Yankees. They were there for a game and went into a speakeasy. All of them were owned by Capone at the time, or the mob, and so he and Joe Dugan and I think Bob Musil, I can't remember, maybe one other Yankee player, went into the speakeasy. And Dugan was kind of a wisecracker, kind of talked out of the side of his mouth. And he just steps up to the bar and says, "Hey, any chance that we could meet the big guy?" And the bartender says, "Are you serious?" And Dugan says, "Yeah, why, sure, And so the next thing they know, there's an armored vehicle outside the speakeasy that picks them up and whisks them across Chicago to the hotel where Capone kept his office at the time. And they arrive and they get into this freight elevator, and there are armed guards at every stop. They're told, keep your hands out of your pockets. Don't worry about the armed guards. Just don't make any quick moves. And they go up to whatever floor, third, fourth floor, wherever Capone was. They walk down this long hallway and into this cavernous room, which Capone had set up as an office. And Capone is sitting there behind this big desk. And behind him, there's a picture of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Al Capone. And Dugan, being Dugan, steps up and extends his hand and says, "Three great men, George, Abe, and Al." And Capone just thought that was hilarious and called in, said, "Bring in some champagne." And they just spent the afternoon drinking champagne and shooting the breeze with Al Capone. And sort of the companion to that story is he was also friends with J. Edgar Hoover. And there's a much shorter story about that. It was really, I think, Waite's second wife, Chris's mom, Ellen, who was somehow became friends with J. Edgar Hoover. Not sure how. I came across some letters from J. Edgar Hoover to Chris's mom, congratulating her on Chris's graduation from Princeton, things like that. Go figure. In the book, Waite mentions, or in the transcripts, he had mentioned that they used to go swimming, the two of them together. Ellen Hoyt and J. Edgar Hoover. So the little story in the book is that they went into basically a dive bar that had a drag show going on. And part of the routine is this dancer singing some song about, could I go for that big boy over there? Yes, I could. And she then drops a key into somebody's lap. And of course, she drops it into J. Edgar Hoover's lap. That's the story. I don't know if it's true, but that's the story.
I hope so.
Stays in character with what little we know. Well, what we know about J. Edgar.
So the 20s come to an end, and his time with the Yankees comes to an end. Really, his stretch as a successful major leaguer comes to an end. He has a lot of ups and downs as he goes forward for the rest of his career. How does his career kind of end up after the Yankees?
Not great. I mean, that second 10-year period was very checkered for him. I mean, he felt that it was because Miller Huggins had passed and was no longer with the Yankees. He was traded from the Yankees shortly after Huggins died. And that was because Bob Shockey became the manager. They actually had been roommates and good friends, Waite and Shockey, but I think they didn't respect each other. And at the first opportunity, Shockey shipped him off to Detroit, which was a real come down. Waite didn't really have that perspective that not all teams were like the Yankees. And so the discipline was no longer there, that's for sure. And he didn't have Miller Huggins there to, basically stay on him. Huggins really felt very strongly that if Waite behaved himself, he would have won 25 games every year and he would have led the league. And I think Waite believed that too, but he couldn't help himself. And once Miller Huggins was out of the picture, Waite just kind of bumped around. I mean, he did have a good half season with Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's, came in the middle of the season, won 10 games, lost 6. That's not too bad. But then, Connie Mack cut him loose, or basically cut his pay, and Waite said, "What the heck?" And Connie said, "You don't like that? Okay, you're done." And so he sort of bumped from one team to the next over the period of the 1930s. He was with the Pirates for the longest period of time, and he did pretty well with the Pirates. Not Hall of Fame material necessarily, but I think he had a solid 7 years with the Pirates, all in all. And I think he enjoyed himself. He liked playing for the Pirates. They were fun guys. But it's really a shame. It's like so many stories in baseball. What might have been, and I think Waite felt that had he not gone astray, that he could have won 300 games. He won 237, but he also acknowledges that what if Mickey Mantle this,
Sure.
And it goes on and on like that.
Sure. He's actually got the Gehrig speech. It's I think it's him, Ruth, and Joe Dugan are behind him there. What is his relationship like with Gehrig?
Also a little bumpy at first, much like the Babe Ruth situation. You have to keep in mind that when Gehrig joined the Yankees, he was young, and he was from Columbia University, an Ivy League school, which was not really very well aligned with the profile of the average Yankee player, and most of the Yankees didn't really care much for Gehrig. One of the funny little stories in the book is that Gehrig used to go fishing for eels in Sheepshead Bay, and he'd bring them home, and his mom would either pickle them or fry them, and then Gehrig would bring these pickled or fried eels, into the clubhouse and expect everybody to eat them. Nobody really wanted to, but Miller Huggins said, you can't hurt the kids' feelings. Eat the eels. And Waite admitted that they actually was pretty good, and Christina Gehrig cooked all kinds of stuff for the Yankees that he did enjoy. But so it wasn't just Waite who sort of saw Gehrig as being a bit immature. There is a moment where he tells a story about Gehrig feeling like he had let the team down. He didn't get a hit in a critical moment, and he returns to the dugout and he starts crying, which that kind of thing did not go over well with the hard-bitten Yankees team. But Waite saw something else in that I think, showed this other side of him that's really quite remarkable. That he said, I've spent my life trying to prove myself and being the tough guy and having this very, kind of, cool, calm, collected exterior, but it was all an act. And he actually admired Gehrig for having courage, in a sense, to have his true feelings come out that way. The relationship didn't really change until Waite had left the Yankees, as I was talking about earlier, and he was out of condition. And what Waite liked to do was go to the Rye Playland skating rink in New York, just to exercise, strengthen his legs and whatnot. Thought it was just a great way to do that. It happened that Gehrig also liked to go to the Rye Playland skating rink, and that's when they really bonded. It was after they were no longer teammates. Waite was a very philosophical guy. He got that mostly from his mother, but his father was like that too, as was Gehrig, and they connected over philosophical discussions about the meaning of life, things like understanding cause and effect and such. And he really, I think, saw in himself, Waite did, almost the inverse of Lou Gehrig. Like he saw Gehrig as the guy he would really like to have been, just because of his tremendous strength of character. and also his very strong sense of gratitude for, in appreciation of others, which, was one of Waite's big regrets, that he felt that he didn't really show enough gratitude, like to, for example, his parents or to Miller Huggins, or to listen very well. And he saw Gehrig as somebody who was totally that, the very strong family unit with his mother and father, and really was very selfless in a way that Waite felt, he could have maybe made some improvement himself. One of the most amazing parts of his story was his induction, what happened during his induction to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1969, and I had a copy of the speech that he gave, because I think it really goes like to this sort of the center of what this book really is all about. He stood up, and Louis Kuhn is there, Roy Campanella, Stan Musial, Stan Kovaleski, who were also being inducted at the time, and he said all the usual things. Thank you very much. This is really quite an honor. And then he paused and he said, "But I could have been a journalist instead." And when I read that, my jaw just dropped. It's like, what journalist wouldn't have killed to have had Waite Hoyt's career? And yet he still felt, like I think I said at the beginning of the interview, that somehow he had missed his calling, that he had not done with his life what he should have, which I think all of us feel that way to some degree. But when it's somebody on his level, only the best pitcher on the greatest baseball team of all time, and yet he still thinks, maybe I should have been a journalist. And the irony of that is, I don't think he saw it that way. He really did end up as a journalist, as the voice of the red. That was journalism.
Yeah.
I don't think he saw it that way, though.
That's the thing that really does come through with his voice in the book. This reflection on life and some regrets, some things I think that he acknowledges he probably shouldn't have done. He does end up becoming a very early member of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 40s, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, around 1945. So this was after he was out of baseball. I mean, he was drinking throughout his time in baseball, as just about everybody did, except for even Lou Gehrig, I guess, was known to drink now and then.
Yeah.
Maybe not Christy Mathewson. I don't know.
But he's supposed to be the cleanest cut guy of all time. But yeah.
Yeah. So his alcoholism, he didn't even know what an alcoholic was, or that he might be an alcoholic. It didn't come to a head until he had left New York and gone to Cincinnati to become the voice of the Reds. And it's really, I think, the most poignant, striking part of the book, where he disappears from his job as the announcer of the Reds for 3 days. He actually goes out for lunch and just doesn't come back. And he checks into the Netherland Plaza Hotel in Cincinnati and just starts drinking. And he gets to a point where he's had so much to drink, and he goes out to the seedy bar, I guess, and has this. He describes very poignantly this last shot of whiskey, and it was his very last drink. He never touched alcohol for 40 years after this last drink that he described. But he took that drink, he went out to the street corner, found a phone booth, called a local hospital, checked himself in, and joined Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a very early proponent. And so that the part of the book that describes that, actually, I adapted from a speech that he gave before Alcoholics Anonymous, which I felt was really epic. And, I hope that maybe it's helpful to some people, his perspective on how he dealt with his alcoholism.
The Reds end up standing by and supporting him, which I think he does not really expect. What is he like as an announcer?
He was amazing. I mean, there really was nobody like him before or since. I mean, and it started with his demo tape. He actually had hoped to be the announcer for the Yankees, of course. The Yankees wouldn't even give him an audition. Actually, it was their sponsor, Gold Medal Flour. The assumption at the time was that athletes were too dumb and inarticulate to be effective booth announcers. And so, of course, that was not true of Waite. If you read the book, there's some words in there that he used that I had to look up that I had never seen. He's so well read. So what he did when he was kind of at the end of his rope, actually. He needed a job. He was married. Chris was 2 or 3 years old at the time. He needed to find work. And so his agent called and said, would you be interested in going out to Cincinnati? And he was like, well, yeah, do I have any options at this point? But he put together a really remarkable demo tape. It wasn't the usual thing of reconstructing a play-by-play. All he did was tell stories.
Hmm.
And the sponsors of the Reds, the Burger Beer Company, was so entranced that they hired him. And that became really Waite's signature, that he was obviously very skilled with the play-by-play, but it was the stories that he would tell in between the action that really made the difference. And most of all, the rain delays. The legend is, which I believe to be true, that he had more listeners when it was raining than when the Reds were playing. And this has been borne out because, as I mentioned earlier, I have a Waite Hoyt page on Facebook. It's facebook.com, Schoolboy Hoyt, /Schoolboy Hoyt. And as much as Waite is not remembered in New York as a Yankee so much, or by the baseball community at large, in Cincinnati, it's a whole other story. There are droves of people that I've discovered who were very young at the time, obviously, probably less than 10 years old, who still remember listening to his rain delay stories, which were just remarkable. It was just detailed accounts of a lot of stuff like what's in the book, of his encounters with people like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Ty Cobb and others. That's why he's beloved, really, because of that ability of his to tell a story, which really goes back to kind of the concept of the book itself, which is he was a master storyteller. And it really feels very fitting and proper to me that, this master storyteller is finally able to tell his own story in his own words.
If you were doing a more traditional biography, is there something that you would have spent more time on with him that he didn't in his writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a couple of things in particular, but one thing that stands out concerns his first marriage to Dorothy Pyle. He had two children, a son and a daughter by his first wife. Chris, my friend, was by Ellen, his second wife. They divorced and didn't see each other for 40 years, which is astonishing.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. Nobody knows why. He didn't explain it in the book. Chris didn't know. There are other family members who had really hard feelings about Waite because of it, and understandably so. He was, I said he was great at many things, but the one thing he really was not great at was being a dad. I don't want to get into that too deeply. I know that Chris feels that way too on some levels. As much as he really loved his dad and he wanted this book. That's why this book exists, because Chris wanted it to happen. And because Chris is such a dear friend of mine, troubled him, so it troubled me. And that's why, we're here talking about it today. So I would have loved to have been able to dig into that a little bit. There was no explanation, so I felt like couldn't even really reference it, and the book could only imply. I mean, he did confess to being a terrible husband and father, particularly in his first marriage, but that's as far as it went. It's really a mystery. The other thing was he wrote an essay for the Saturday Evening Post in which he trashed the National League as inferior to the American League. This was when he was playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers of the National League. So he was trashing his own employer. And not surprisingly, he was let go like 2 weeks later after this article appeared. I would have loved to ask him, what were you thinking? Why did you write that, that article? You can guess, some pretty educated guesses maybe as to why he might have done that, so that he could say that he quit. He jumped, he wasn't pushed, or he was going out on his own terms. But again, he didn't explain why, what was the reasoning there. When I asked Chris about it, he saw it as like a suicide note, which is effectively it was.
Yeah. You talk about his relationship with his family. There's a pretty incredible thing that came out of you writing this book. Next month, you're going to be in Cooperstown, and there's actually going to be a Hoyt family reunion centered around your book reading. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So when this book project became known to that side of the Hoyt family, there was some trepidation on their part, because they felt like they hadn't been properly recognized, which is, I completely get that, completely understand how they would feel that way, and concerned that this book would continue to cut them out of the story, kind of whitewash them out of the Waite Hoyt, whatever mythology. But because that was not the approach, they, certain members of the family who had been sort of skeptical of this whole thing became very excited about it. And the upshot of all this, the most wonderful thing is that, yeah, I'm speaking at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, August the 8th, 1 p.m., and about almost 20 members of the Hoyt family from both iterations, from the Dorothy Pyle side and the Ellen Burbank side, will be there, and many of them have never met each other
Wow.
before. Some of them were, I don't really know. I sensed that there were some hard feelings here and there, as in any family. I mean, I don't think that that's unique to them in any sense, but it's just such a remarkable thing, that would be, if this book accomplished nothing else, my goal was to make Waite Hoyt better known or as well known as he deserves to be. But the fact that it brought his family back together, it's hard to top that. I mean, that feels really, really good.
Yeah,
Really good.
that's really incredible. One more question for you. I want to go back all the way to the beginning of the book. You
Mhm.
got Bob Costas to write the foreword? How did this happen?
This whole project has had a certain magic around it. I mean, these boxes appeared out of nowhere, and it felt like the way the book should be written it just all made sense. It was, people said that must have been really hard. No, it was dead easy. I mean, I just loved every minute of it. So part of, my remit as an author is, as you may know, is that it's my responsibility. It's incumbent on me to get people to write the jacket blurbs. And so I put together a spreadsheet, like a wish list of all kinds of people that I would like to have write jacket blurbs, about 75 in total. And some of them were famous people. Some of them were mainly just well known among baseball fans. People like Don Honig, who actually happens to be somebody who my uncle was friends with, just by coincidence. So anyway, Bob Costas was just on the list with a lot of other people. I couldn't find an email address for him, but I was able to track down his home address, and I just wrote him a nice letter. And sitting home one evening, and my phone rings, and it's Bob Costas. Or as I said to my wife afterwards, Bob effing Costas. And he was really interested in the book. I mean, his interest in the book had more to do with Wade as a broadcaster, understandably. I mean, he obviously knew his reputation as a baseball player, but he really took to that part of the book, especially. And he was just really gracious about it. Originally, it was just, okay, I'll write you a blurb. And some time went by to the point where I thought I wasn't going to hear back from him again. And then I got an email from him, and he sends this blurb that's about 4 paragraphs long. And he said, it's a little long for a jacket blurb. Maybe you want to use it as a forward. And I'm like, well, yeah, and so that's how that happened. And really just, again, just kind of another magical moment in this journey with this book.
That was Tim Manners, co-author of Schoolboy. Our 16th issue of the Twin Bill Lit Journal came out on July 16th, featuring all sorts of great writing and art. Coming on to close us out is Joseph A. Chelius, reading his poem from our latest issue.
Wearing my father's mitt. Without his knowing, I wore it that spring while playing the outfield. My father's left-hander's first baseman's mitt I found buried among rollers and paint cans under the workbench in the cellar, mending the laces with knotted twine. On the wrong hand it felt clumsy, but when the ball would come my way, I'd drift under it and catch a slant, a minor skill I developed, as if imagining he'd stop by the field in the middle of the workday to watch for a while, his hands shifting on the handle of his briefcase before he nodded approval and turned away. That is, seeing me with his glove, which had grown soft and pliant, might loosen his stance, even ease the tension that filled the kitchen when he returned from the high school with its faculty and students, that undermining superintendent, steam from our plates rising as we ate. That I'd recover from out in left field, my father as a boy on the sandlot greens of Yaden, Pennsylvania, his body lithe and unfettered, scooping throws around the first base bag.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,